Today on Inside the Numbers, I have on Coach Michael Fahey. Coach Fahey is currently the strength and speed coach at Florida High School in Tallahassee, Florida. He's also the co-founder of the company OVR Performance, in which he brings quality training technology to the marketplace at an affordable rate, including the OVR Jump and the OVR Velocity. Coach Fahey is most famous for producing and writing the famous Netflix documentary West Side vs. the World, telling the story of West Side Barbell and Louis Simmons, a world-renowned powerlifting and strength coach. I highly suggest you watch that. If you're a lifting nerd, if you like to train and lift weights and see the history of Louis Simmons, I highly suggest you watch it. In this podcast episode, Coach Michael Fahey discusses the development of the OVR products, mostly the OVR Jump technology, and its use in jump training. We discuss the application of jump training and how tracking numbers can open the doors for increasing the quality of training. We also discuss the value in training ground contact times and how simple the training can be to increase sprint performance. This was a jam-packed episode full of value, and we hope you enjoy. You're listening to episode 2 with Coach Michael Fahey. Welcome to Inside the Numbers, the Rock Daisy Sports Performance Podcast with your host, Coach Cody Hughes. Join us to unlock the secrets behind athletic performance as we break down the metrics and transform your collected data into powerful, actionable insights. Tune in for exclusive interviews with top coaches and professionals who are revolutionizing their training programs with data. If you love what you hear, please share it on X, Instagram, and YouTube, and tag us at RockDaisyAMS. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Inside the Numbers. I'm Cody Hughes, and I'm here with Coach Michael Fahey. What's going on, Coach? Thanks for coming on.
It's going good. How are you?
I'm good, man. Hey, I just wanted to let you know I'm super stoked today because I just got a notification my OVR Jump is going to deliver in a couple hours. I'm pretty fired up about it.
Yeah, happy to hear that. I heard today was the day for you.
Yep, super stoked about that. You know, I've used probably every jump piece of technology on the market for the most part. So like I've got force plates, I've used a sky hook, I've used jump mat, I've used plyo mat, which all have their place, you know, in training and all of those things. And what decided to get, because to me, the OVR Jump reminds me of like a contact grid. This is just me off the top of my head thinking, okay, like a contact grid from things like Muscle Lab, but those things were always like crazy expensive and things like this. Like what sparked the idea of having a jump piece of technology that is so simple, right, and being able to get the cost down to where pretty much anybody can be able to afford it?
I mean, it comes from the fact that I coach and that this is what I like doing. So especially the type of stuff that I like to do with my kids is we jump a lot, we measure everything. So I went through a lot of jump mats. You know, stuff would break all the time, and then you go through those delays when you wouldn't have something, you know, like there's nothing more frustrating than when you get the kids rolling, jumping, and then suddenly it's not there. In the case of, you know, certain mats, it's because those mats are not actually designed to ever be moved. You know, the actual manufacturer of them does not want people doing that. They're made for mostly like auto manufacture and stuff. So I went, you know, way into the weeds of trying to figure out how to get basically a supply of mats for when manufacturers didn't have replacements, or for when retailers didn't have replacements. And I saw how expensive those were, even for the company selling them. And simultaneously, my wife worked in an industry where they did the same thing, but, you know, for a company that tried to be a lot less obvious when they're counting people and measuring who was where and doing crowd control and security. And I was just playing around with, you know, trying to hook, you know, lasers into my jump system to replace that. And immediately it opened up, you know, that this could be done way cheaper, which was another thing of, you know, like I have a principle based on my own experience of, if I spend under $300, it's probably not going to cause a fight in my marriage, right? If I go over that, you know, I got to check in and I gotta, you know, I gotta pitch why I'm making that purchase. So I thought, you know, like my principle in everything that I've ever done is I am not special. if there's one of me, there's a million of me. And what could you sell a million of and not make money? There's basically nothing. So if you serve yourself, we have the internet now, you can connect to a million other potential versions of you who have the same need, want the same thing. So I just made something that I wanted. And then when we started to go that contact grid route, like it's lighter, it can be produced at a larger scale, faster, cheaper, and then suddenly like all the ground contact things that you could do with it. And then we came up with, a special way to make it, because even things like what you mentioned, some of those other companies and pre-existing devices, like they were still finicky and wonky and still weren't really made to be like portable easily, and again, I'm not coming at things from the point of like a data scientist in a lab, like I collect all this data, but we're not testing, we're training. Yeah. So it can't exist in my space if it can't be put away safely and quickly, if it can't be operated by, I occasionally have elementary schoolers, but mostly my crowd is 6th to 12th grade with a couple post grads here and there. So like I got to be able to have a 6th grade boy with behavioral issues and learning disabilities and, ADHD and a phone and distraction of other kids. It has to be simple enough, portable enough, light enough. Like it has to fit, again, if it fits my needs are extreme, logistically. Yeah. So if I can do for me, it'll work for other people. And again, that idea of how many people do you know who are sitting on the sidelines watching, listening to podcasts, reading blogs, watching videos, and can't afford the thing, like they'll wait forever to get a piece of technology because they can't afford it.
Yeah.
And it's just simply, what if you did the back end work on the business side too, to you created a robust enough framework that you could have things in high enough quantities that you could drive your price points down. It's a really big risk, but if you actually believe in your product and you believe in that purpose and you've done the research, that's our whole bet, is that there's a whole lot of people who want technology, and there's a whole lot of other industries that frankly have much more advanced products that sell for a whole lot less. So it's not like I love the jump. I'm really proud of it. That's like my baby. But at the end of the day, like we didn't make an iPhone, and sure, they probably make iPhones a lot cheaper than we're able to make our product. And it's because they make them millions at a time. Yeah. But so if you have that faith in like the market and you, again, do the due diligence, and that's why it took, we've been working on this since 2020. Sure, making the actual device is the easy part. It's getting everything else in place to have a sustainable system to be able to, get these products made and to people and to be able to continue affording doing so.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's exciting to see all the people, because technology, I feel like, has boomed, especially in strength conditioning, like almost to the point where it's almost overcorrected, where some people feel like if you don't have technology, you can't do a good job. And that's just not true, but
did I just
it
mess that
certainly
up?
does help. Do what? You there? Yo, can you hear me?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Sorry, I was having problems with my Wi-Fi, so I went off.
That's fine.
So I didn't hear whatever you just asked.
That's fine. I can edit this part out. It's not a problem. This software, by the way, so like it kind of uploads on the back end to make sure the quality stays high. So it may look blurry like while we're doing this, but it corrects itself on the back end. But it's got to be able to upload as well. So hopefully I get all of this as well. So because right now it's showing that, because technically it uploads on the fly. Like mine's on 99% uploaded, and yours is at 0. So I'm wondering, I don't know why it's not capturing that, but
it says 94 on my screen.
So anyway, okay, good, sweet. Well, that's good. Well, maybe that's just what it is. So we'll go from there. So anyway, so I'm excited about this product because, one, it's made with the coach in mind. There's a lot of pieces of technology, and in my experience, I've got a lot of technology in my hands, and I've used it enough now to where like all the excitement kind of is not as exciting anymore. And you realize that with technology comes headaches, and you have to have upgraded systems in order to take advantage of technology. Whether you have that technology is just new iPads, right? Or if you've got an AMS or some type of program delivery software, or if you have some type of hardware such as a jump technology or velocity-based training technology. So with that in mind, I know you have a specific system on how you use, for example, let's just take the jump, for example. And that way we can talk a little bit about jump training in general. So when you said your logistic needs are really extreme, so let's pair like, okay, you wanted to create this jump technology because of a very specific way that you train the jumps, but you also needed it to accomplish your logistic needs. That sounds like the same problem that a lot of coaches I talk to have. So when it comes to this product, how are you using it every day in training?
All right. So we'll set down, say at the top of our workouts, and this isn't always at the top. Sometimes, periodically through the year, there are teams that don't work with me, and let's say that they run over in their slot. And when that happens, like I think yesterday I had close to 70 kids. And to contextualize, we have a 1,400 square foot weight room. We have 10 racks. Okay. We've got a big like bay door that opens up, and then outside of that we have a patio area. And sort of adjacent to that, we've got about a 30-yard field. So out in the field, we've got sleds and stuff. So, I can funnel groups of kids out there if, say, we're squatting and they're not, our younger, newer kids who aren't ready to squat yet, they might be out on sleds, or as one group is coming off of, say, the racks and transitioning into their accessory work, we'll pull back raises and Nordic benches and stuff out onto that patio area so we can kind of migrate one group of kids from one area to another. And then during the day, that room is also, it's supposed to be locked, but 9 out of 10 days, at least one door is either left unlocked or propped open. So it's not exactly a secure space. So having, when I use jump mats, I used to bring in an 800-pound hand cart, and that's the weight threshold rating on it, not the actual weight of it. But I'd bring a hand cart and stack, piles of these 34-pound jump mats on the hand cart, wheel them in from my SUV every day across campus, and at the end of the day, wheel them back out. Now I bring a North Face backpack, and I've got like 8 or 9 jump units in there, pretty comfortably fit with, a bunch of velocities and whatever other kind of things that we're using. We also use a lot of like kitchen timers with little magnets on. But so I can bring all my stuff in because I don't work on campus. I'm not there all day. I'm working on OVR and other stuff all morning. And then I go in, I'm there for a few hours, I come back out. So just the literal transport in and out, to have something that the jump is 1.6 pounds. It's 18 inches long and modular. So, you can fit a bunch of them in an average size backpack. So from right there, we'd come in out on that patio area, again, to maximize the space. And so this is also weather dependent. I'm in Florida, so the 2 o'clock or the 3 o'clock group in our region, they're probably going to be good. Where, they're going to come in, they're going to jump outside. We'll set up, typically in pairs, like I've talked to you before about. So we have, instead of an 18-inch surface, it's a 36-inch front end, and I'll have 2 to 3 stations of those set up. I'll have a clipboard, a couple clipboards every day. I use Google Sheets to track everything and assign. I have a really, really messy sheet. It makes sense to me. It makes sense to my kids. And I'll sort of just highlight whatever the columns that we want that day. Everyone's sorted into rosters. I'll print that out. So we'll start with like dumbbell jumps. They'll do typically 4 to 8 singles of a dumbbell jump. They'll record their maximum height. On that roster, we've got, I've talked to you about this before as well, but we've got waves, levels listed on there. So it might say next to their name, like level 1, 15/20/25. And basically that means on week 1, they're using 15-pound dumbbells. On week 2, 20s. On week 3, 25s. So I'll tell them what week
Okay.
it is, and they generally know based off of whatever our main exercise is, they know what week it is. So we exist on 3-week waves. What those functionally look like is really just really shortened linear waves. That's all a dynamic effort wave really is it's a piece of linear smushed into a conjugate structure. But so they'll see like, oh, we're doing 6s this week, or we're doing 5s this week. That must mean we're in week 1. We're doing 4s and 3s. We're in week 2. We're doing 2s and 1s. We're in week 3. Week 3 is our heavy week. So it's going to be our heaviest dumbbells. It's going to be our heaviest squats. It's going to be our lowest volume. That means it's also going to be our slowest speed. You don't jump as high with the heavier dumbbells because they're slowing you down. So the same way you don't move your heaviest squats as fast because they're slowing you down. So we've kind of tied that same flow into both our jumps and our squats. Both are, and our squats and our bench are largely on the same wave. But so we jump at the beginning, and because those dumbbell jumps are a little slower, they act both as a warm up and as potentiation for right after that. So they record their highest of those 4 to 8 dumbbell jumps, which are single reps. Then right after that, they go on and do 4 to 8 just standing verticals. And so that's kind of like our bread and butter system. We might have a second jump within that, especially when I have large groups. So there might be, broad jump mats out, or we might have, I've also got two of the Tandem Sport Vertex. We've got 2 Ronin jump boxes, though only one fits in our weight room currently. So the second one's in my garage, which my wife is thrilled about. And that's my garage doesn't have like garage things in it. It just has gym things waiting to move as soon as I can find space.
Right.
But so we do this
so
jumping.
We're at a good spot.
Yeah.
Like there's so much we could talk about just in this jump system, because you just laid out. Okay. Cause I feel like this is a good place to kind of stop and unpack. So we've had these conversations before, but I want to make it as simplified as possible. So you're jumping every day, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Jumping every day unless weather or time changes it.
Sure. Yeah. But as far
the
as
goal is jump every day.
We're gonna jump. Yeah, and we've got feedback with our system. We've got prescriptions, okay, levels. We're gonna break that down too as well, okay, and trying to understand what this jump system looks like. Because I know you mentioned to me like a lot of this came from Jared Bidney with Explosive Mechanics. If you've listened to him on podcasts, he talks about the same thing. And I've also heard Jared mention, like, because a lot of people look at training, so you have like your squatting, a lot of time is your max effort work. You can make the argument that with high school kids, how much are you getting out of dynamic effort work, or peak power squat or speed squat, whatever your language is, that these dumbbell jumps basically work as your speed strength or your peak power or your dynamic effort, or insert other language here, but the key to these jumps, from what I'm hearing, it's not just being able to pick a pair of dumbbells and jump as high as possible. One, it's getting feedback and creating intent, because who cares what we're doing, right, if we can't get feedback to increase the stimulus from intent. To me, intent is everything. Do you see your kids' intent go through the roof because of the numbers that they've tracked and the numbers that they're seeing?
Yeah, that's all it is, or that's the majority of it. It's also with all of these things, whether we're talking ground contacts and hurdle hops or jumps, bar velocities, with any of it, you have to understand like the sort of like real cruelty of coaching and training is that when athletes are most physically like supple and pliable, when they make the fastest adaptations, they have simultaneously the greater the rate of physical adaptation, just in terms of the life cycle. Simultaneous to that, the lower the sort of like cognitive and conceptual abilities. So, you think about like men, like your frontal lobe isn't fully developed until you're, at least 25. So like there's a huge reason why there's a big change in behavior from like, that like young bull energy of your like early 20s and, like a dude in his mid 30s. Like there's a reason why there's that big gulf. And a big part of it is just because your body stopped developing and your body actually started for most people, your body started the process of falling apart, at a relatively rapid rate. So as your body, like ultimately all this comes down to the fact that like our existence as animals, basically, like our DNA, our basic like biological structures are adapted for us to be animals in the wilderness in a wide range of environments, but each of them with challenges for food, shelter, and safety. And so, like, if we lived in an ancient time as people, we might still have to run from a large predator. We might still have to fight to defend ourselves regularly. So, like, our evolution as people is at least tens of thousands of years behind where we are now. So we live in the safe, cushy, modernized society, but we still have these sort of things of like, how would we have survived, on the plains 10,000 years ago, if we were getting weaker? Like I'm 37. I would have been an old man in those times. I'd have to be wily. I'd have to have a sense of, things beyond myself. So all that is to say, like, so when kids are young and dumb and their body adapts at this crazy rate, they're also sort of in this hardest point to communicate with them and let them know, like, what's the objective here? What's the concept? What should the intent be? And, they don't really speak even the same language as you. So, and they're not inclined necessarily to listen to you, especially if you can't find some common point of reason and interaction with them. So when you can point to your score went up, like now they have very clear directives of even communicating with you. How do I make my score go up? And you can tell them, I can tell them like their amortization phase or the rate of force. I can get on the whiteboard and start drawing out, the basic physics of a premise. And they'll just look at me and But now they can just hop on the device and essentially they can experiment. And when they see, oh, my score got better, they're going to keep going that way. And, now when you tell them, hey, try this thing, it's going to feel weird. Here's what's going to happen. And they try it. It feels weird. And their score does what you told them it would do. And now they have just a little bit of context and now like it's a lot easier for them to follow you along. And if you're right, or you're good at explaining what you're doing, it's really, it's super effective for me in terms of getting buy-in, especially when you start to pair those data points of, a kid jumps poorly. To take this one step back, before they do anything, for most of my kids, I try to get them to weigh in. So we have a physician scale and we have a physician stadiometer. So I'll get them to weigh in. If I got a kid who, let's say his max weight is, the highest he's come in this semester is 152 pounds. And we're in Florida, it's over 100 degrees in terms of heat index. It's in the high 90s. The humidity is through the roof. Like you're walking through a muggy swamp. We have outdoor hallways. Like you're outside in the elements, and it's exhausting. So like a kid comes in seventh period or right after school, and immediately I see like, well, you weigh 148 today. You weighed 152.6 last Thursday. So, like something has happened. And you can tell the kid, hey man, you need to watch what you're eating. You need to watch what you're drinking. Then they go and step over on the stadiometer and we get their height. Well, they were 5'9.5" last week. And today it says they're 5'8 3/4. The same implement. This is another crazy thing that like over the summer.
Yo, what?
Yeah. Your spinal fluid in your discs and everything. You got a bunch of discs in between each vertebrae, right? What are they filled with? Liquid, right? Your body is mostly liquid. So if you're dehydrated, you're going to be shorter. Later in the day, you're going to be shorter. Gravity's compressing you all day. So if I measure a kid in the morning and I measure him in the afternoon, he's half an inch shorter in the afternoon. Same scale, same stadiometer.
Yeah, that's wild. I've never even considered that.
Yeah, but you'll get a kid and he'll be down almost a full inch. And now he freaks out. Now he's worried. Like that's a big threat to like your identity as like, especially as a young male or as an athlete. So you get worried. And
Hey,
now what's
if
great
that
is I
height
can
goes from
tell them,
6 foot to 5'11",
yeah.
like, uh-oh,
So so now it's, oh, coach, am I getting shorter? And you go, I don't know if you're getting shorter, but man, you need to drink more water. You need to
yeah,
hydrate. Are you eating at lunch? Like, did you have breakfast? Oh, you didn't eat anything? Well, your body's not going to hold water as well. So even though you're drinking the water, like it's just flushing through. So you're not hydrated. So now I've seen you're down several pounds, you're dehydrated. And I saw that I didn't have to survey you or anything. I know your recovery's been trashed. Now I can tell you like, hey man, like watch your workout. This is gonna, like today's gonna be a tough day. And now they're down 3 inches on their jump, and like just at every turn, like there's so many opportunities to have that conversation of, and sometimes like it's just one variable that's off. Like they're well hydrated, all these things, but their sleep has been bad. They're stressed out because of school. They got in a fight with another kid who's across the weight room right now. Like you start to see like, one thing is down, cool. You've been, like you were sick the other day, your jump is down, but they can still hit they can still hit their squat, they can still hit their bench, or, they can still hit their dumbbell jump because it's just one gear slower. So their body has just a tenth of a second more maybe of time to organize that impulse, and they can still bring it together. But their best jump isn't there. They're 1 inch up on their dumbbell jump, but 3 inches down on their regular jump. And that can be demoralizing to a kid. But now with all these data points, you can explain to them of like, well, of course, man, like because we're on a Thursday workout. Like you worked out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Like you worked out and ran on Monday. You already ran today before you even came into the weight room on Thursday. So of course your jump is down. Like we're not surprised about that. But hey, look, your dumbbell jump was right where, within a fraction of an inch of your best, or you had a small PR. So just imagine in 3 weeks when we get back to this, or really 2 weeks at that point, when we come back to that same weight and you're fresh on a Monday, man, you're going to hammer that. You're going to hit like a 2-inch PR right away.
right. I feel like all of these numbers, like when you start collecting anything, especially you simply said, I just started collecting body weights. Just that alone opened up this massive conversation just from observation. And remember, data can be a lot of different things. It doesn't have to be some fancy, we're not new school. People have been collecting data forever. You're collecting data every day with your eyes, in my opinion. It's just not quantitative, So leading it back to the jumps, also understanding that this process is super messy. It's not always going to be so linear of, I jump once, I jump again, it gets better, and then just keeps getting better and never fluctuates. And it opens up the opportunity to educate, but it also opens up the opportunity for us as coaches to learn something. Because there may be a mix of variables we haven't quite encountered yet. And the longer you coach, the more of those variables combinations, right? Whether that be sleep, psychological stress, social stress, not being hydrated, not being fed well, not being motivated, not having, you could have a time of, I just don't feel like it. Morning versus evening, time of the year, where they're at, maturity-wise, age-wise. I mean, think about the millions of variables that go into these one-off performances. And something as simple as a jump with a tool like OVR, which is why I bought some, is because of how simple it is to get feedback. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think this is my thought, and I just want to ask you this. When it comes to in the nitty-gritty of training, we're not talking about data in a lab, right? That reliability is more important than validity.
So
you know what I mean by that? Like
you're saying, like precise.
The numbers can be consistent.
Yeah.
If
precision versus accuracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it, like, because at the end of the day, there is no competition in which an OVR device is used to, hang points on the scoreboard. So that doesn't matter. It's like neither is, whether it's Vertec, whether it's a force plate, absolutely none of that matters. And force plate manufacturers will tell you that there's differences between force plates. So even that, the 100%. idea of validity is itself an abstraction. Like it just depends on what it just depends on what your standard is and what your definition is. Like so long as you know your definition of what your standards are for that test, and then what the sort of margin of error with your device is. And like, again, we are, for the jump, we're using light. So how much you weigh has nothing to do with it. For a mat-based system, using an industrial switch mat, a safety switch mat, whether it's one company uses a 60-pound switch mat. That means if you put a 45-pound plate on that mat, it cannot tell that it's there. That leads to the higher numbers. But it also leads to a difference between if you have two kids getting the same score at even the same body weight, they don't jump the same height. They only jump the same height if they have the same takeoff and the same landing strategies. All the way down to what their footwear is. The kid has to wear the same shoes because that foam will absorb slightly different. So if the kid switches his shoes, maybe he gets a higher score. Now we use a laser that's a set distance off the ground, so nothing, in terms of pressure, there's no change, right? But, like, again, I used mat-based systems for years, had tons of success with them. We'd see their jump go up, their broad jump go up, their 40 come down, their 100-meter come down. It's just one piece of the puzzle, but it was relatively consistent, relative to
this is why
itself.
I feel like the argument of people arguing about whether or not a jump on a jump mat is 40 inches or not, that's crap.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
I feel like that argument is so worthless. It's completely worthless. Like, why are we arguing over? Because there's not going to be some, like you said, there's not going to be some competition where everything needs to be standardized in order to hang points on the board. We're just trying to get our kids better, man. Like that, That's all that matters. But that doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be some type of standard in place. So let's talk about how you do your jumps, because I'm really intrigued on this. I remember you mentioned to me you need to police the jumps a little bit at the beginning just to try to set some standard, but once they learn the system, they roll. So you're doing singles. You said 4 to 8 singles, loaded or unloaded, however. Like that rotation, so when they step in, let's talk like the actual mechanics of stepping in to the grid, between the two, pieces of equipment inside the contact grid area, whatever, and they hit their jump, right? What are some of those things you need to police in the beginning to standardize some of that? Because it's still needed, right? But it doesn't need to be overkill. So I'm just curious, like how you police those jumps in the beginning.
Yeah, well, so what I really am policing is I'm trying to police, again, I don't truly care about the height. I used to work for the NFL and we did a lot of, at the time, Al Davis was still alive, and you would hear basically daily, like, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Adaptations come from intent, right? Like they come from intent.
100%. Now,
you can get stronger adaptations when you match the stimulus, when you marry it perfectly to the intent. So you have a kid move an implement as hard as they can, and that implement slows them down during that process to the perfect speed to create whatever adaptation you want. But if the intent isn't there, it doesn't matter if the stimulus is the right prescription. The intent is paramount. So if a kid is cheating, they're trying, right? So now we just want to make sure, are you trying something that is going to give you a bigger carryover? So like if a kid, let's say, an example that I use all the time, and I'm going to sidetrack slightly to explain the underlying mechanism. Anyone who's trained young kids has seen, like, if you've got like a middle schooler, a freshman boy or girl, you got a young kid with relatively low training, relatively weak. That first time you say, have them go bench, and you give a small young kid a 45-pound bar, it's a crapshoot of whether that bar can come up at all. If it does come up, it tells you relatively little about how much they can get, because you put 5 pounds on that bar, they might have gotten 6 reps with a 45-pound bar, and they all just moved easy. And you ask the kid, was that hard? And they might say yes, but the bar's flying. You add 5 pounds, the bar comes halfway up. It doesn't even stop to pause. They just bring it halfway up and it comes right back down. And what's happening is that kid And usually like the worse an athlete is, you'll see this, like the sooner they shut down. What's happening is their body doesn't know what to do. Their brain doesn't know what to do when it encounters that resistance that slows their arm down. So it's not that their arm can't go slower, it's that, or even that they can't lift it. What's literally happening is like the safety brakes of their brain are just shutting them down. And because the bar is above them, the bar falls back down to their chest. So now invert that. The ground's beneath you. A kid goes to push into the ground. The very first thing you need, like, why are we jumping? To send a strong impulse into the ground. And as we do that, what happens? A reaction force comes back up at us. So you feel that pressure. Think about jumping right now. You feel that pressure build up in your foot as you jump. That pressure releases when your foot comes off the ground, right? Because you're no longer pressing against anything. But when the harder you push, the harder that pressure is, the harder that reaction force coming back at you is. Well, if you saw that adding 5 pounds can just cut off your brain from pushing through your arm, the same process happens pushing through your legs. So watch like a young kid jump. My daughter is almost 2. She's just started like jumping, and you see that she squats down, she begins to extend up, but she doesn't reach full extension and drive through her feet. She takes off the gas. Her brain does not allow her to punch through that resistance. She's strong enough to, but she shuts down. Now she thinks she's jumping as hard as she can. She is. She's jumping as hard as she knows how to, right? And she doesn't have the language to have that conversation or anything, but that's just what you see. I go to gymnastics class with her. That's what I see across the board. And you'll see like one girl who really stands out, and you watch like, what's different with her? Her feet her feet actually push off the ground, and she jumps way higher than everyone else. And she looks like the little athlete, and everyone else, everything's just shutting down. And over time that perpetuates. And so all the other kids have bad feet, and that girl has great feet, and she becomes elastic and springy. And that girl's a D1 athlete eventually. Well, that girl's mom was a gymnast, but she wasn't a good gymnast. So there's there's your example of like, is anything truly ever nature versus nurture? They're ultimately almost the same thing. It's incredibly rare, in my opinion, that nature is insurmountable. Like we see nature when it makes an athlete so robust that they overcome bad training. But I'm of the belief that if you gave any kid the right situation, the right circumstance, just habitually, they would project and appear as an elite athlete. And after only a couple years, like those things would be so ingrained in them. But so anyways, to bring all that back, so when younger kids or new kids, when they jump against the ground, they're going to feel that resistance and they let off the jump. So they're not pushing through. So when you got a kid who does that, what are they going to do to try and jump higher? Just like my daughter. When my daughter stops pushing down, she brings her knees up. Now, she has never done a single rep on the OVR or just jump or a plyo mat or a force plate. She's never done a measured or, structured jump of any sort. We've never I've never said anything to her other than, can I see you jump? That's all we've ever done. So this is a completely like natural response, which is another thing when people, try and like shame people about like their kids jump videos. It's like, you don't understand, like you don't work with children, because that's what children naturally do. They don't understand. Like you're trying to get them to overrun or override the wiring in their brain that feels most natural. So it's also that all these kids have weak posterior chains. So again, they're going to go where they feel strongest and safest. Well, how can they extend their hips, extend their knees, extend their ankles violently when they don't have the supporting strength or musculature? What's going to happen as a response? They're going to hit that point of resistance. Like if you are familiar with like Louis Simmons language, they're going to hit, sort of a conceptual equivalent of like a mini max, a point of minimum leverage and maximum resistance, and they're going to shut down. That's where everyone fails. Say on a bench is at that same point. On a squat, it's at that same point. It might be 2 inches off your chest. It might be, a couple inches out of the hole. Like people fail in predictable spots. Same thing happens when you jump. And if it happens when you jump, it happens when you run, but the coach can't see it. So the very first thing is, so if what the kid will do, because the kid wants their numbers to be as respectable as possible, they're going to try and pull their legs up. And that's ultimately like not going to do anything because it comes at the expense of what they could be pushing through the ground. So let's say that a kid pulls their legs up, let's say it's a short young kid, they pull their legs up, and so they land with their hips 4 inches lower than, like they cheat their jump by 4 inches. How much does the map think that they cheated? 2.
Yep.
Because they only affected their flight time on the way down.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to cheat 2 to get 1. So when people, so you go, okay, well, even though you cheated, like, how do you improve now? You've cheated. You can't, you want to get another inch of cheat, you got to land 6 inches lower. Eventually, the kid can't land any lower. They get stuck. And how they get out of it is by learning how to push through. So if I'm only testing the kid, again, if I'm only testing the kids once a year, once a semester, even once a week, these things all matter. If I'm testing the kids this frequently, and we've only talked about what I do at the top of the workout, I come back around to it on the back end of the workout. So like if our kids are jumping 8 times a week, like they're going to make really fast progress because they're doing it a lot. But also when they get stuck, they're going to get hammered on it and they're going to experiment a lot to get back out of that hole. And eventually they come back around to the realization of you can only cheat so far, then you're done. But no kid wants to be done. They eventually want to get out of that hole. And so you watch a kid, on say a just jump mat back in the day, you'd watch a kid get stuck at like, 31 to 33 inches forever. And then eventually they'd start to change how they jump. They'd dip back down in, 28, 29, and then they'd come steadily back up. And, it might take them a year, but they get to 36. How they get to 36, their jump looks a lot better. So they get kind of stuck in this hole of, like anything else, if you cheat the technique, you're cheating it because, again, ultimately what it comes down to is, short-term gains, but ultimately the short-term gains are a reflection of a short-term relative advantage. And that relative advantage is you have a weak posterior chain, so you can't get a lot of, you have a weak posterior chain and you have, I think that a lot of rate of force development is basically a cognitive response. So they just don't know how to do it. So eventually, and they don't know how to do it until they like accidentally step into it. Once you get them to feel it once, it becomes easier to get them to feel it twice. Once they can feel it 3, 4, 5, all of a sudden it's a pattern that they can repeat, and a lot of those bad habits start to break.
Is it a lot of that when in order to even get to that in the first place, that's where frequency comes in. The more you jump, eventually you're going to hit it.
Yeah. So I say this all the time. When things are true, they repeat. A truth is true all the time. Like a law. It's true all the time. If you have something that's true only circumstantially, then you don't have a full understanding of the mechanism. So when things align, it's true. That just means you're missing a chunk of the equation, right? So a jump is just an expression of force through different postures. Sprinting is an expression of force through different postures. Squatting, deadlifting, all of these things are the same. So if you go look at the Bulgarians, maxing out every day, taking a training max every day. Taking a training max, no problem.
Sorry, I thought somebody was making an announcement. And I was like, hold up. That was really loud, but it was just a Bluetooth mistake. We're good.
Yeah, that's all right.
But yeah, sorry. I may have thrown your train of thought off there.
No, I'm good. I'm dogged in terms of what I want to say. But so you look at like the Bulgarian method for, which again was for mostly like squats and Olympic lifts. But they'd have a daily training max basically. How can you squat every day? Travis Mash has done this, Corey Gregory's done this, Max Aeta and all these different people have done this. How can you do it? Well, your intensity is super high, but are you doing sets of 8? No, your volume comes way down. So you listen to like, oh, I'm jumping every day. Yeah, 4 singles, like 4 weighted singles, 4 unweighted singles. These are not very high. These are not very high volumes. Tony Holler, Feed the Cats, sprinting, as often as you can. He's not saying go do 10 of anything. You might do 1 or 2, right. You're hitting that intensity. Intensity is usually not what breaks athletes down. It's volume. Could you play one play of an NFL football game every single day if you were an NFL athlete? Yeah, and you'd probably feel better, but
Yeah.
it's the playing the full game that crushes you, like um, so you can I'm saying a principle that it was Zach Goodman who, when I very first started talking to him a few years ago, he called me up and said, like, I listen to your jump system. I listen to you talk about your jumping. I listen to Jared talk about squatting and benching 3 times a week, heavy. I listen to Tony Holler talk about sprinting multiple times a week. All of y'all are talking about relatively low volumes, high levels of intensity and high levels of exposure, or frequency. So frequency can be high, intensity can be high, but volume must drop as a result. So I'm just balancing out the same equation as everyone else, and I treat everything else very similarly. I think that a lot of Jared's lifting principles, and a lot of his jumping principles, mesh very well with like a feed the cat style approach of very low volume sprinting. Um, and I think that when you measure or track everything, all the time, Louis Simmons was very fond of saying, like, he didn't learn much from advanced coaches. He learned most of what he learned from, bad coaches and bad athletes, because the bad coaches, or newer coaches, novice coaches, they're the ones who will ask you a question you've never been asked before. Something that you always thought seemed obvious that you never were asked to explain. This happens all the time. Like, you'll make discoveries in conversation because you always view things from the same angle. And someone will ask you to explain one thing, and then they will ask you to explain something else. You knew both things, but asking them close enough. This is also how interviewing works. This is how, like, in terms of my past and stuff as a documentary filmmaker, my my thing in that was I made big burly dudes cry like that. There's a system, there's a way to set up an interview to make someone cry. And it's the same basic idea of, even if their guard is up, I make you recount like one type of memory, and then I make you recount another. And you would never put these two things close to each other. And then you have this realization about the two. And normally that's going to come down to, like, you realize like you'll never have that again, or that's fleeting, or it makes you think about how you're aging and dying all the time. Like, something happens, two things that you have always been aware of are just drawn. It's both sides of the equation have existed inside of you forever, but you've never been tasked because of your own biases or thought process. You've never drawn a relationship between the two. So an athlete will make you do that, because you'll look at them and go, how does this not make sense to you? And that will cause you to have to explain something about their existence to them. And suddenly you'll go, oh man, I've seen this kid, basically. I've seen a version of this kid like 8 times over, and I just put 2 and 2 together.
Yeah. And that comes with a lot of time,
Yeah.
time and experience when those things start to repeat itself. I relate exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
For sure. And a lot of that is the job, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not just the wave system, not just the method, even though a lot of people argue over methods. Mm-hmm. Intent in both the implementation of the training, but also the intent of the coach creating the environment for that training to be effective. That to me, that's the special sauce of coaching. That literally is where, like, the driver of, because you could take the same method and the same program and put it in a different weight room with a different coach, and the results aren't going to be the same because the kids aren't the same, the variables are through the roof, and you probably are never going to replicate the same because the variables are always high. So that's kind of like what I've realized with me now collecting an immense amount of data and noticing that it's really difficult to try to predict in our situation like high school, because the variables are all over the place. When in a place like college settings or pro settings, it gets a little more consistent, even though it's still chaos. I mean, chaos theory is still apparent everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. So that I think a lot of coaches get a piece of technology and they jump for it, or they use it for like a month, and then now all of a sudden they think they have this predictive model. I think that's hilarious.
Yeah.
There's no way. Like I'm not saying you can't see patterns or you want to have this massive evaluation system. But even with me, being at one place for 7 years in the same environment, adding a lot of technology, I'm still staring at a screen half the time, scratching my head going, where does this need to go? How do we interpret this? And I've now noticed the more simple you make it, I feel like the better chance that a 14, 13 to 17-year-old kid is going to be able to come back to intent, which comes back to adaptation, which full circle comes back around to results.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's as simple as you make it. Now, let me jump back to a little bit of nuts and bolts in the jumping, because this is just a personal question. So we talked about waving your dumbbell jumps, and you had certain levels. Basically, your dumbbell loads are going to be relative to your squat number. Now, let me ask you this. What if you get a big guy, like an offensive lineman? Say he's 330 pounds. Say he squats mid-fours, right? 450. Pretty solid. But he doesn't jump very well at all. Would you still roll with that like higher level, with like a higher load with their jumping, like 30s in their hands or 35s or wherever they're at in that wave, even though, but their relative squat, for example, is still only like 1.3. Does that make sense? So like, do you think the relativity on the extreme sides of the equation could change the load strategy for someone that's like an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman? I'm just curious.
So that's something I've thought about before. We still want to keep, if we down regulate the dumbbell jump, it just becomes redundant to the unweighted jump. Because now now he's not being incentivized to produce greater force, right? Ultimately, if he's relatively strong, he's going to jump well, and if he doesn't, there is likely, especially if he's a big guy, likely he's been a big guy for a very long time. That means likely he has been nurtured away from things like sprinting. Likely he has been nurtured away from, playing soccer when he was young, or, just playing
Yeah.
tag. Like, he's probably been herded by adults to do the things that he's perceived as being good at. And that's come at the expense of not having the exposures to other things. So I see things like this a lot, where I've seen plenty of big guys who, were a great jumper just waiting to happen. Now at 300 and, what did you say, like 340?
330, yeah.
330, yeah. So it'd be very hard to imagine a 330-pound high schooler having, they might have a relatively big squat, but, like, is he a 2x body weight squatter?
No.
Yeah, that would be statistically very unlikely. Even if you're a great coach,
Correct.
it's hard to get a high schooler to a 660 squat.
Yeah.
And again, as a high schooler, now, could they get there as a 20-year-old? Like, depending what they want to do, absolutely, easily. But just again, the rigors of high school, it's unlikely that you're going to have many kids in that. Like, there'd be a lot of things stacked against them. But so he's got a pretty good squat. In this case, he's got a squat that would put him in my highest level. So using level 4 for us, that'd be using 30s on his light week, 35s on his medium week, and 40s on his heavy week. And that's in each hand. So that's 60, 70,
Yep.
80. And the basic premise of that is keeping him between 15 and 30%. So let's say if he was a 500-pound squatter, or if he was a 600-pound squatter, we would ultimately not take him past those 40s as the heaviest. And so that does get into basically what you're saying, of like, there is sort of a relative cutoff point. But that, for me at least, that cutoff point is just higher. We ultimately, everyone kind of hits a point where the weight is so heavy that it will slow them down to a point that detaches them at all from their unweighted jump. So it becomes too slow of a movement. Like, this is one of the failings of a lot of the reliance, on trap bars, say for loaded jumps. I'm not a big fan of the trap bar loaded jumps, especially as compared to if you didn't have dumbbells and all you had was trap bars, great. But to me, it's a lot easier to manipulate the load of a dumbbell within the range of where I'm having most kids jump.
Yeah.
With say my lightest kids, I don't know anyone who has a 30-pound trap bar.
Right.
So like it just isn't a good like pairing from a load standpoint. And then also like if you got a small kid, their hands are out really wide, versus a dumbbell can kind of be kept like very close to your body. So I just think it's a better, if you have dumbbells or you have fat bells, or if you have appropriately sized kettlebells or something, like having a bell implement that you can keep tight to your body, I think is more advantageous. But
Gotcha.
no, that in that kid's case, I'm going to bet that even while let's say his quads, his glutes, they might be relatively strong for him, I'm going to bet that his feet are relatively weak for him. And so that's where you're going to see that ultimate disconnect of his feet, whether he jumps or especially if he runs, and especially if he gets upright, his max V is going to be slowed down because his feet, the deformation phase of them, they're already going to be big and wide. They're going to deform, because they're right at the point of impact. They're right at the point of the transfer force. So any inefficiency at that point will have a much larger effect than, say, an inefficiency at the knee, which will have a lesser effect or a larger effect than an inefficiency at the hip.
Yeah.
So the higher you get up that chain away from the point of contact, and this is where a lot of like the what's strong enough and stuff, like
Yeah.
everyone talks about squats and or even deadlifts, or they talk about things that neglect really. You can squat a lot of weight and have really weak feet,
Right.
so like
And you could probably see somebody who squats really well, but their ground contact times on like hurdle hops are just garbage.
yeah, I see it all the time. And especially the people who, again, like I said, like the people who they show some early promise at a strength-based, sport or movement. They like getting in the gym. Well, did they also like getting out and, playing tag in the street or playing pickup football or going out and playing basketball? If they didn't also like that, then they didn't develop those qualities in the foot and ankle and lower limb. So they're good at something that tells you very little about the lower limb. Then they become like I used before, the basketball analogy of you take an appropriately inflated basketball. It should, I believe the metric is it should bounce to like 67% of the height that you drop it from. Take a basketball that is 1 pound underinflated, and it, because I think it's 8 pounds per square inch in a basketball. I've charted all this out before to do this analogy better. But like if you underinflate the basketball slightly, it's only going to bounce 54% as high. So how do you make the 54? Most people are flat basketballs. They're underinflated. So already they're at this detriment of about 13% efficiency on every foot strike. Well, you think about like how do you get that flat basketball to bounce as high as the properly inflated one? You have to throw it down harder. So you need more strength, more force relative to that impact. Okay, so you can make a bad athlete, the underinflated basketball, you can make him jump just as high as the good athlete, the properly inflated basketball. Once.
There's more force.
Yeah, it's real easy. Once. So
Yeah.
coming out of his stance, exploding off the line. So if we drop them both from 10 feet, for example, he's got to make up 1.3 feet on bounce 1. But on bounce 2, he's now got to he's at 54% of 54. And the other guy's 67% of 67%. So with each subsequent bounce, that gap gets larger. So how do you even it out? This is where it gets to like running. How do you even it out so that on the 5th bounce, how much force would you have to put into the first bounce to even it on the 5th?
Oh,
And that's where it gets to like
insane. It's
yeah.
impossible.
Yeah, and so yeah, that's basically what it is. But so you have to inflate the tire, and that's where we get into the hurdle hops and stuff, and measuring that ground contact time, and appropriately scaling that so that the kid, the hurdle has to be low enough that the kid spends a short enough time on the ground. if your hurdle's
What's
too
your
high or your
number?
box is too high.
What's your number? What's your contact time? So let's talk about because to
Yeah.
me, RSI is a really tough metric for me, like the traditional RSI.
Yeah.
I prefer using ground contact time under constraints.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So just simple, like, okay, we're trying to create a certain ground contact time and get over a certain hurdle. Okay. So what is the number? If the constraint's going to be, if I've got to create more force to get off the ground, but I'm trying to accomplish the same task of getting under a certain time. All right. We got the hurdle low enough to accomplish it for most kids. What is the contact time you're looking for in that hurdle hop?
So I've listened to recently like a lot of podcasts that are hitting at the same concept. And they hit at something that, again, I like happened into. So I was using hurdle hops, and the hurdle hops that I was doing, and that I still do. So we'll do this largely at the end of the workout because it takes more setup. So as the kids are getting into their accessory work, I'll go out and set up the hurdles. So I'll set up the hurdles. Let's say as like a standard setup would be like anywhere from 4 to 6 adjustable hurdles set at 18 inches. Okay. That means that we're going to have either 3, if it's 4 hurdles, we're going to have 3 ground contacts, 3 zones of, they take off in front of the first one, they land after the 4th one. There's 3 in betweens. I like having at least 3 in betweens because I found there's a lot of kids who can get 1 good ground contact, but again, it's at the expense of setting themselves up to properly land. So when you put a pattern of 3, you got to have an actual strategy that you can replicate. You've got to have a technique that you can replicate. Otherwise, you're not going to make it. You're not going to make it through 3 hurdles. So and then from there, if you can make it through 3, we'll go to 4, we'll go to 5. And as soon as I can, basically, I'm going to, snatch another like 10 to 20 jumps from our inventory so that I can extend these way, way out to absurd levels. And I want to see what happens if you can get a kid to stay under a threshold for, say, 10 or 15 ground contact times. Like, how springy can you really make a kid?
Sure thing.
But so the mark that I was using, the sort of like traditional definition of what is plyometric is under 0.2, 0.2 of a second.
200 milliseconds if you want to use that whatever.
Yeah.
It's okay.
0.200.
You're trying to be in the 1 something. Yeah.
You're
trying to be 0.1 something.
Yeah. That's just to meet the traditional definition of plyometric. And so first thing that I realized, like, when I started doing this was like, oh, no one knows what plyometric actually is. Number one.
Yeah.
Because
Still don't.
Yeah. I'm saying like no one, because number one, who was determining that? How were they measuring it? Because I've got the easiest way, literally the easiest way in the world to set up and measure. And if you were doing this more than a couple years ago, you had some harder and or wonkier way. Again, if you're using a system with a pressure threshold, then it's not telling you the actual number. So it's not telling you that number, and that number is going to be different depending on how the kid lands. So a kid with stiff ankles who's a little lighter is going to have a different number than, say, your big kid who plods and spreads out as he hits the ground. So that number will be different by a couple hundredths of a second. It might say 0.2 for him and 0.2 for him, but one of them will appear to be on the ground a little longer, but you can't really tell. So the human eye can't see the difference. And virtually no one had access to equipment that would allow you to see the difference, even if you had, say, force plates. And even then, like, you're pretty much limited to doing something that's stationary, and so it's like, okay, so this is just a theoretical limit that people brought up. But again, with everything, one of the things that's really hard for people to understand about all training concepts is that everything is contextual. So it's contextual to, like, if you think about like the force velocity curve of an athlete, a weak athlete can't go as slow as I can. A weak bencher can't bench as slow as an advanced bencher. They also can't bench as fast.
They'll fail.
the yeah, well
Very true.
they're limited on the speed side and they're limited on the force side. Their force velocity curve is simply smaller. Everyone tries to
It's
like
very
create
yeah.
bubbles. Yeah, everyone tries to create bubbles and shapes within the force velocity curve when the reality is like, why do you I know a ton of power lifters, right? I know guys who
Yeah.
will slave away for a decade to go from a 5 to a 600 pound squat, and all they do is squat. And then I can take a high schooler who is, a high schooler or a college student, definitely college student. I can take someone who has very little, like different genetically about them, who
Yeah.
might have like far worse leverages. And while running and jumping, while fleshing out the force velocity curve, I can get them to make the same progress. Even if you compare them to a powerlifter of the same age, an athlete will usually make faster progress. Like the same guy, if he trains as an athlete and he just fills in some of those added points and he's looking to lengthen his force velocity curve on both sides, it will lengthen a lot easier than if he's only trying to distort one side. Or it's sort of like trying to build your biceps if you have no forearms, or if you have no triceps. Or why do the biggest benchers ever? A lot of them will say, Scott Mendelson or Tiny Meeker or Jimmy Kolb talking about, or even Julius Maddox talking about guys who have lifted more weight in the bench than anyone else. And what's one common accessory that they all have? The deadlift. Why is it important that all of them deadlift? Well, it's because if their lats don't grow, their arms and chest won't grow. The body wants to maintain certain relative proportions. So,
Yeah.
likewise, younger kids, weaker kids, their dynamic effort speeds are lower. More advanced guys, Dave Hoff, even for Westside, he squats faster than his training partners. 1,300 pound squatter has to squat faster than the 1,100 pound squatter. Which means he has to be at a lower percentage in order to go faster. He has to do that because his force velocity curve is larger. He also has to do that because 1,300 has the potential to fatigue you and stress you a lot more than 1,100. So all of these things,
Yeah.
like those numbers are not static on the graph. It's like the shapes are the same on the graph, but the numbers change, the scaling changes, and this happens with everything. So listening to Rolf Ullman speak on like Mike and
Yeah.
Brooker, and he's talking about well, if you've got Sue
Time to
at
peak was a big one with him. Talking
time
about
to
time to peak.
peak. Well, I'm thinking about
Yeah.
that, and I'm like, that's the exact same thing. He's talking about the faster his guys get, the less ground contact time they need. And I go, I've been doing time to peak with hurdle hops this whole time. Because when's your peak?
That's right.
Your peak velocity is as you leave the ground.
When you're no longer in contact with
Mhm.
the ground, you're slowing down. So our time to peak is how long we're on the ground. So you can use ground contact time on the jump, and it's giving you time to peak. The
Yeah.
velocity also has time to peak, but
Correct. Correct.
so we've got it. We've got you covered in two ways there. Or like if you do a seated box jump up onto say a Ronin, if you want to, I'm all about mixing media and mixing tools. If you throw an old school box down in a seated position, and you can do it Ullman style where you're changing and constricting that range of motion to raise your hips up or lower them, and then you lift your feet and you slam them down into the array of the OVR jump, and then you jump up onto say a Ronin jump box where you're adjusting it by 1 inch, and you say we're only going to count the jump if it happens within a ground contact time that is close enough. So, anyways, Ullman was sort of talking about, you've got to, or listening to like Tony Villani just yesterday or the day before, maybe I was listening to him on the Voodoo uh, during podcast or whatever with Steven, and him talking about, again, if something's true, it's true all the time. So it's true under all these different expressions of implements. So talking
Yeah.
about, acceleration profiling using a sled or using a shred mill, slowing you down a certain percentage, whether you want to be slowed down 20% or say 50%. Um, I think I'm more of the slow down about 20% crowd. And so considering that for most of my kids, if that threshold is zero point 0.2 in terms of thinking about traditional definitions of plyometrics, I wanted to initially, I was like, I want to make sure that we're well under 0.2. So it went from a couple
Yeah.
weeks of just seeing where the kids at. And then I was like, well, we'll raise the hurdles when they hit 0.2. That was really easy for kids. I was like, I want something that's going to challenge them a little more before we raise. So let's go 0.15. You know, can you hit?
I bet that was hard. I bet that was difficult.
Yeah, well, it was for a few weeks, and then the kids start to figure it out, and suddenly like everyone's hitting 1.5. So now, and then I adjusted everyone down to 1.2, and like hardly anyone could do it. On 5, I think I've had 1 or 2 kids hit under 1.2, 0.12. But then I'm listening to like Rolf, and I think he said something about, you know, like if they're hitting, I don't know if he said 1.2, but he said like 1.5 would be too slow. You know, so that same sort of idea of thinking about, well, if you're about 20% higher, you know, where's the disconnect that a lot of people see with strength in terms of speed? A lot of times the disconnect looks to be like, I think, more evident with, say, sprinters in a 100 when they start to get under 11. You know, like you can get a kid down around 11, even if they're relatively inelastic, just by being brutally strong. You know,
Yeah.
power ratio, and then you start to see that it's very hard for most people. Like those things are disconnecting, and I've had a bunch of kids go under 11, but I started to think about like when you're under 11, your ground contact's probably going to be around 0.1, you know, so around
Yeah.
100 milliseconds. And when you start to get down into the tens, now you're consistently, you know, well under 100. And when you start
Yeah.
to get under 10, that's when they're talking about being, you know, in the low 80s, the high 70s. So looking at my kids and going like, okay, well, most of my kids probably have a ground contact time on max V a little over, you know, they're probably in that 11 to 12 100s, like most of my kids. And then the good ones are going to be around 10, maybe in the 9s. I haven't gotten to do enough stuff because our track's been under construction and stuff through a lot of this. And when it's not, it's 100 degrees outside, and I melted a bunch of jumps once trying to track max
Sure.
V on ground contact times. But you know, so looking at there, and like I just had a kid who one of my pitchers, we timed 40s twice in the last week, and he set PRs both times, despite the fact that he's gained about 25 pounds of body weight since the spring. You know, and it doesn't look like, you know, all the best weight, but his velo off the mound is up. And when we were doing hurdle hops, he's one of my 2 kids who's under that 0.12 threshold on 5 jumps. And I watched him run the other day, and he ran a 4.79 with the style of setup that we had, which was he had only been under 5 once before that, before the last 2 weeks. And he wanted to run the other day after a squat workout. And again, the 4th workout of the week, and he ran a 4.91. And this is on a sidewalk because, again, our track is under construction. So like fatigued in an odd space on, you know, choppy concrete. And he runs like, you know, what for him was a very good time, and then follows up a few days later with just without the fatigue of squatting beforehand, and he's down over a 10th beyond that. And you know, his coaches and the other kids, you know, the other kids were kind of, they've noticed he's gained a lot of weight, and it looked like you could see him bouncing down the, you know, down the sidewalk. You could see that he wasn't getting sort of bogged down around that like 25 or 30 yard mark the way that some of the other kids were. It wasn't that he drove out any faster or any harder. It was that he just kept riding that. Like he got upright and could cycle over, and he's bouncing.
Yeah.
And
he could handle that elastic force. Like he could handle it, you know.
Yeah. And he's
at that point of the run.
Yeah. And he's He's still like sub 200 pounds. He's like 190, but he's probably only like 5'9". Um, so he's a thicker kid, but he's never been the kid who was the fast kid. He's always been the
Right.
kid who was a few steps slower, just trying to look respectable. And when we started really drilling the hurdle hops, like him and another young kid started to stand out, where I was like, as heavy as they are relative to their peers, they're hitting ground contact times way lower. Like, they're two of my best kids, and they're also we have kids who they struggle with, for the most part, with weight. I don't have any kids on that roster who are 200 pounds right now.
Yeah.
But my best ground contact times come from a couple kids who are north of 190. And sure enough, when they go run, all of a sudden, tenths are just melting off.
The younger kid,
That's
he was
crazy.
down like 0.6 over the summer, and our track was closed. We did very little running. I don't think he was there for a single day where we ran, but he loved doing the hurdle hops. And he loved it because he stood out like instantly doing it. But that's been something that, again, even before we did the just jump, when we just do a bunch of hurdles and have a mat at the end, kids who squatted well, who jumped well, and who ran relatively pedestrian to their peers. Because that's another thing, is that like all of the ratios and stuff that anyone looks at, it doesn't really matter what the exercise is, like your ratio only really holds up in your space. Because again, it's all so multifactorial. Like if your kids do a lot of sled work, I'm talking like West Side, like walking with the sled, they're going to have better feet and ankles generally than the kids at most places who do very little or no sled work. Those kids, again, those kids are not going to be the same inflated basketball. So they're going to need a higher ratio to hit the same weight. Or certain
That makes a
people
lot of
who,
sense.
yeah.
Coming full
So
circle.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, so all of those, so many of those dialogues, or just the general dialogue about training, does a system work or not? Like, it doesn't matter. You can't do what I'm doing unless you commit to doing everything that I'm doing, because everything that I'm doing is a response to the kids in front of me,
Yeah.
right? Like when you test all the time, if you're testing, if you're paying attention to the data, your kids are probably going to improve immensely, in part because if you're paying attention to the data, then you're probably also going to be alerted to make changes at some point. And even if those changes aren't well informed, even if they're like the wrong conclusions, that's going to yield reactionary data to that. But if you're in a situation where you're not seeing data, then all you can go off of is the coach's eye. That works when you got like a small group. That can work exceptionally well. But you're always solving for like your situation. To take it back to like powerlifting, it's like, the trend, say 10, 15 years ago was, kids getting like Smolov programs. Smolov, all his programs would be numbered. And, I'm doing Smolov 57. And then there'd be YouTube videos about like Smolov 57 doesn't work, but Smolov 59 works. It's like, guys, you understand that number was for a specific athlete.
Yeah.
Like if you're doing, if you're, 17 years old and 5'6" and 138 pounds, and you're doing a program that was made for Smolov's 39-year-old, 4-time world champion who weighs 380 pounds, like his program may be insanely different because you don't know anything about that guy. Like maybe he's a type 1 diabetic or something, where like he had special considerations built into his program for something that had nothing to do with training. Maybe he was a laborer during the day. You want to do like Chuck Vogelpohl's workout, to bring it back to Westside. Chuck started training at Westside as a high schooler, as like a 14-year-old, like a freshman. And Chuck just loved to work. So he had a work capacity that would kill people. If you came in to try and do his workout and you hadn't been training like him for several years to build up that work capacity, you were dead.
You ain't gonna make it.
Yeah. So likewise, like all this stuff. So with the dumbbell jumps, that system in the levels, I love things that have levels like that, because that is the problem of the dumbbell jump weights are contextual to the output of the athlete. And so as that athlete, if they work, they're going to migrate the kid up to the next level. And if that works, it's going to,
Right.
so the system has to be set up in a way where I can get the 6th grade boy who's never trained before, or the 6th grade girl who's never trained before. And by the time they're, in high school, they're on level 4 and their jump is up however many inches because it worked. So you're not dealing with where the athlete is. Your training every day is just a bridge between where were they and where are we trying to get them to. You're never so everything has to change because the point of it is to change. The training is the change that gets them just from A to B. So for me, none of this is born really out of theory. It's maybe informed by theory, but why do we do the 3-week waves? Well, part of that is with Westside, I don't know that I ever used a Westside system that predated the 3-week wave, but they didn't start on 3 weeks. Louis didn't read a book and go, okay, we're doing 3-week waves. No, they started on 5-week waves. When he went these 16-week linear progressions, I'm only really getting anything out of the last 5. Then it was, okay, go to 4s because the last couple weeks of the 5, we're so burnt out. Let's go to 4s. Many months later, man, we're so burnt out. Let's go to 3. And then all of a sudden it was wow, this is working markedly better. And then they tried going down to 2s and it didn't work as well. So bounced back to 3s. If you don't overshoot your changes now and then, if you don't see where the edge of that cliff is, sometimes you do fall off and you institute something and go, our kids went backwards a little. We're going to go back to how we did it a couple months ago. But with that 3-week wave system, I'm always, if I put something in, I'm generally if I'm making a change, that change is almost always going to be for a minimum of 6 weeks. So I can see that cycle repeat twice over. Because what if there was just a bug that went around and, most of my kids are on the same teams together. So a flu bug goes around and everyone's training kind of gets junked for a week out of that 3-week wave. Again, so I'm going to have bad data and a bad conclusion unless I run through it at least a few times. I'll probably run through something for a full semester before really trying to draw. Occasionally you do something, you see a big surge from a couple athletes, and then you go okay, did they do anything different than everyone else? And if they did, if you can isolate that, then you go, okay, well, I got 60 athletes a day. I think these other few kids over here are kind of similar to them. I'm going to have them do the same thing. And then if it spikes for them, then, after a couple months, the whole group is now, this is going to be part of our standard. That's where the jumping at the end came from. That's where the contrasting with belted marches or sleds or trap bar, that's where that all came from,
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. Well, hey, this was a ton of good information. If anybody, listens to this podcast and wants to learn more about you or ask you questions, where would you prefer they find you?
I'm most active on Twitter or X, just at Burn the Ladders. You can hit me up on Instagram, whether it's Burn the Ladders or Westside Film. If you have a complex question, you're probably going to get a series of voice notes back. Many a person has been delivered basically a personal podcast on something that I'm sure they didn't think was going to take that long, but I have to drive from one end of the county to the other end pretty frequently. So if you happen to be the person who's asked me a question during that time period, you're probably going to get a really long, detailed response. And if you have follow-up questions after that, if it needs a part 2, I'll probably just go ahead and say, here's my phone number. If you really want to know something, ask me, text me or set up a call or something. So I'm easy to find.
Awesome. Well, good deal. Well, hey, you've always been great to me and always answered my questions. I knew you'd be a great guest, and there's a lot of packed info on this. And guys, go ahead and head over to OVRperformance.com. Check out the products. Okay, make sure we market that for you guys, both with their OVR Velocity and their OVR Jump. Like I said earlier in this episode, my OVR Jump will be here today, and I can't wait to toy around with it and find how it fits in my system and continue to implement all the things we talked about in today's episode. So, Coach, thanks for coming on.
No problem. Thanks for having me.